Hello, and welcome all. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon for our Conversations with Olmsted webinar, Parks, Equity, and Public Health. My name is Georges Benjamin, and I'm the Executive Director of the American Public Health Association. Our mission is to improve the health of the public and achieve equity in health status. And one of the ways we do this is by partnering with other sectors to address the societal factors that influence our health. We are honored to be part of a diverse coalition of organizations working together on the Olmsted 200 campaign. You know, Frederick Olmsted designed hundreds of parks from coast to coast, starting with New York Central Park in 1858. He's known as the founder of landscape architecture, but Olmsted was also a visionary social reformer. In fact, Olmsted was an early member of APHA. He led a committee on the sanitary value of parks and nature. In the late 19th century, America was in a public health crisis. We had open sewers, crowded living conditions, pollution and environmental degradation, really non-existent sanitation, and widespread disease. The environmentalists of the time understood that the environment in which we live, learn, work, and play significantly impact our health. Olmsted saw the connection between public health and a thoughtfully built environment. It's what motivated much of his urban park design. He viewed these not just as pretty places, but also as an antidote to poor health. We know that access to safe, quality parks and green space can positively impact your health, from increased physical activity to improved social cohesion and mental health. Additionally, urban greening and green infrastructure can help cities mitigate and adapt to the effects of climate change. Yet, all communities do not have equitable access to green spaces and parks. A recent study from the Trust for Public Land found that parks located in communities of color are 5 times more crowded and half the size of parks in white communities. Neighborhoods with park inequities suffer negative health implications, such as higher obesity rates, premature mortality from cardiovascular disease. And these inequities are driven by discriminatory practices and policies of both the past and even today. Parks have a role to play in achieving health equity. By working with communities and across sectors, we can create park infrastructure that enables healthier communities for all. I am excited for this afternoon's discussion to learn how we can work together to achieve that vision. And with that, I'd like to introduce Didi Petra, the President and CEO of the National Association for Olmsted Parks, the managing partner of Olmsted 200.
Thank you, Dr. Benjamin, and welcome everyone to the third installment of our Conversations with Olmsted. As you've heard, I'm Didi Petra, President and CEO of the National Association for Olmsted Parks, managing partner of Olmsted 200. 2022 marks the bicentennial of Frederick Olmsted's birth and a year-long celebration and exploration of Olmsted's life and legacy. You can learn more at olmsted200.org. As we just heard from Dr. Benjamin, when Olmsted began his career, America was transitioning from a rural to a more urban society. In Olmsted's lifetime, the US population went from 10 million to 75 million. At that time, cities were dangerously unhealthy. In so many ways, Olmsted was the first to make the connection between the built environment and public health. He understood that thoughtful design could have positive social, cultural, and health impacts, bringing people together. Thanks to Olmsted, parks functioned as lungs of the city, offering spaces that could foster physical and mental well-being. In the 19th century, the miasma theory was prevalent. It held diseases like cholera were caused by bad air. Olmsted wanted to address disease, and his prescriptions, more parks and green space, more trees, better drainage, contributed directly to improving the human condition. He was wrong about the theory, but he was right about ways to limit disease. As a scientific farmer on Staten Island, he made special tiles to help drain a swampy area. In Central Park, he and Calvert Vaux established a dairy where children could obtain free and safe milk at a time before pasteurization. As vice president of the New York Charities Aid Society, he sent notices to ministers and physicians describing the healthful benefits of the parks. In Olmsted's time, doctors in fact began to prescribe a trip to the park, similar to a project today known as Nature RX. Olmsted's focus on public health was reinforced by his experience as first executive secretary of the U.S. Sanitary Commission, forerunner of the American Red Cross. In 1861, as the Civil War began, he left Central Park to lead the commission. There, he improved health outcomes for Union soldiers through improved ventilation, drainage, waste disposal, and careful food preparation. Thousands of lives were saved, and the experience proved critical in strengthening Olmsted's belief that sanitation and service should undergird landscape design. The logo of the Olmsted 200 celebration is Parks for All People, a foundational principle of Olmsted's work. But as we heard from Dr. Benjamin, significant racial and social inequities still make this goal an urgent one. To address the issues of health and equity, today we will speak to 4 experts in the field. We are in the midst of a public health crisis, a pandemic and chronic disease that call out for creative and collaborative thinking. So please use the chat box for any commentary and rely on the Q&A box to ask any questions of our panelists today. We will plan to conclude in 1 hour and will answer as many audience questions as possible at the end. With that, let me introduce our fantastic speakers. Our moderator, Mitchell Silver, is the former New York City Parks Commissioner who oversaw 30,000 acres of parkland. He is internationally recognized for his leadership in the parks world and urban planning profession, and is currently a principal with McAdams, where he advises on urban planning, parks planning, and land use, with an emphasis on diversity, equity, and inclusion. Richard Louv is a journalist and author of 10 books. It is Richard who coined the now famous phrase, nature deficit disorder. He is the co-founder and chair emeritus of the nonprofit Children in Nature Network, supporting an international movement to connect children, their families, and communities to nature. Autumn Saxton Ross is first Vice President of Education and Chief Equity Officer at the National Recreation and Parks Association, a founding partner of Olmsted 200. Autumn's role reflects NRPA's priority to advance racial equity and intersectional work between parks and recreation. Vaughn Perry is the Director of Equity for a brand new park in the pipeline, the 11th Street Bridge Park in Washington, D.C. His role advances the organization's efforts to recognize and remove barriers to fair and just distribution of resources, access, and opportunity, starting with race. Thank you all so much for being here this afternoon. Mitchell, I will hand it over to you.
Thank you, Dee Dee, and it's certainly a pleasure to be here with a number of experts. Before I actually go into the formal Q&A with our experts and panelists, I want to share with you a little bit about my experience as New York City Parks Commissioner, particularly during the pandemic. First, I have to note that I grew up in Brooklyn, blocks away from Prospect Park. And in fact, my first visit to an Olmsted park was at 1 month old when my mother took me there with my brother, and I even have that photograph back then. Who knew 50 some odd years later, I would be Parks Commissioner of not only Prospect Park, but all the parks of New York City. And then I had the privilege as Parks Commissioner to work in Central Park. That's where my office was located. And so it was such a privilege to be part of an amazing, amazing list of incredible Parks Commissioners over the years. But in terms of the pandemic, I think we all realized, and Olmsted was ahead of the time, that parks and park staff became essential. It was always clear to us in the parks world, but it became more clear to all the residents, not just in New York City, but around the country. And I want to think about it for a second. Everything was closed, and the only thing that remained open were our parks. It became our office, our gym, our wedding venue for birthday parties. It became our sanctuary of sanity. And so many people went there, and Olmsted knew that that would ultimately be its purpose. And so I remember on Fifth Avenue, as people would walk into Central Park, you would literally see the anxiety and stress drip off of their body as they entered this beautiful green oasis. And so I watched the impact it had on everyday New Yorkers. And we also know that these places became a place of healing, but also a place of joy. It was a one place New Yorkers can go to feel comfort, to feel beauty, to feel joy, to feel healing. And it is my strong belief that parks, and the NatureRx may be headed ahead of its time, should be considered part of our healthcare system. So those are my observations. I think parks across the country, if not the world, are now playing a very different role, and I got to see it firsthand as Parks Commissioner. And so I'm very excited that we're having this conversation today to really underscore the importance of parks. Olmsted 200 is that opportunity for us to talk and share. So now I'm going to shift gears to our questions. I'm very excited, as I said, about our panelists. They're all experts in their own regards. So I'm going to ask this first question to Richard and Autumn. As we previously heard, during the mid to late 19th century, when Olmsted worked, America faced a public health crisis: open sewers, crowded living conditions, and rampant diseases like cholera. In fact, Olmsted's first son died of cholera, and I believe it probably influenced him to pay close attention to how we can help heal others since he lost his son. He believed that contact with nature was essential to physical and mental well-being, and he was ahead of the medical community. So my question is, today there are more and more data about the benefits of access to parks. Let's talk about some of the data that we know of today. What are the benefits of public parks and access to nature? And what can we do to ensure that all, and I want to underscore all, have access to those health benefits? Richard?
Well, one thing that's changed in the last few years, well, first, Olmsted really was far ahead of his time. And one of the questions I have is, why do we have to keep relearning these lessons? Now we are relearning lessons that Olmsted did teach us long ago. And we have to be careful that this moment doesn't pass, both because of the value of parks and the rediscovered value of nature to our lives, but also the inequitable access to nature. And when I talk about this, I'm not only talking about parks, I'm talking about the whole city. You know, the nature right outside your window, the nature at the end of the cul-de-sac, all of that. The research was pretty limited. In 2005, when I was researching Last Child in the Woods, I could find about 60 studies that were directly related to the impact of contact with nature for children on their development and adults. And the academic community had kind of forgotten or was ignoring this. Since then, the number of studies has increased to over 1,000. You can go to the Children in Nature Network website. We have a online library of as much of that research as we can summarize there. And it's free to anybody in the world to go and use. But everything from attention deficit disorder, that was some of the first recent research. The University of Illinois showed just walk through an urban park, walk through trees in an urban park, the symptoms of attention deficit, even for 5-year-olds, would decrease. Myopia, the myopia epidemic in the world has something to do with the fact that we're sitting in front of computers all the time. That research is in Australia, and it's quite impressive. Again and again, the research shows that this is literally a life and death matter. In neighborhoods that have few trees, very little nature, there are all kinds of things that happen to people's health that don't happen as much, anywhere near as much, when people have nature in their neighborhoods or nearby park. So it's literally a life and death matter.
Richard. Autumn, what are the benefits of public parks and access to nature? And what can we do to ensure that all have access to those health benefits?
Yeah, so following behind some of the statements folks have made earlier, when I think of Olmsted and his idea of lungs of the city, and focusing a lot on just two dimensions of health and wellness. So thinking about the physical aspects of activity, the mental aspects of being close to nature and communing and recognizing things bigger than yourself. But something we add on and we believe strongly in Parks and Recreation are these other dimensions. And so not just these public spaces that give folks a place to walk, but also the dimension of connection and social cohesion and not being isolated through recreation and leisure studies. 100 years ago, President Coolidge talked about the essential nature of recreation and leisure. And so these additional dimensions, Parks and Recreation, our local parks and recreation, our nearby nature folks manage over 11 million acres across the country. And in that, a third of our folks are doing farmers markets and providing nutrition to communities that don't have access to healthy foods. We also are in the top 5, almost probably the second in the country when it comes to providing meals to children across the country, outside of the schools, through supper programs, through snacks, through lunch, through breakfast, through childcare. And so continuing that whole child method. So it's not just that physical and mental promotion of health and wellness that parks can do, but we add an additional layer in recreation and leisure, providing sports. And we all know the wonderful lessons that can be learned as adults and as young people in participating in those leisure activities. And so that's an additional layer that we add with recreation and leisure in parks and around parks. And then also with access to all. I always like to call Parks and Recreation, in my experience with nearby nature and local places, as a gateway drug to these larger natural spaces. And for me, that provides access. If we think about who lives in cities, who lives in these dense places, who lives by local parks and recreation, they are mostly marginalized communities, whether that's through race and ethnicity, whether it's through disability, whether it's through income or lack of access, over and over again, depending upon what category someone may be in. So we really believe that access will start with these nearby nature, and nearby nature is Parks and Recreation.
Thank you, Autumn. I'll be coming back to you on this next question, and also I'll ask Vaughn to chime in. We previously heard the data point from the Trust for Public Land study, The Heat is On, that parks located in communities of color are 5 times more crowded and half the size of parks in white community. Now, I want to editorialize. I don't believe they're crowded. I like to say they're popular, but we'll just put that aside for a second. So what does equity mean in the context of parks and public spaces, and what additional barriers do we see when it comes to access? Now, before you respond, I want to make sure that when we talk about barriers, we should talk about the physical, the regulatory, or the lack of amenities. And to me, the telltale sign about access or inclusion is that someone can say, I feel welcome here, I belong here. I just want to add one other point to kind of drive this home before you respond. I remember when I was Parks Commissioner, we had a sign in New York City parks, in a public park, that said you could not loiter. I understand private property, but for public property, the word loitering means to sit or stand idly by with no apparent purpose. That's what we want people to do in a park. But that rule can be weaponized. If you are a nice white couple sitting on a bench, oh, enjoy yourselves, enjoy nature. But if you're 5 Black or brown teenagers, you're loitering, you shouldn't be here. I'm so grateful New York City removed that as a rule in 2017, and we launched a Yes Loitering project because we want all, including teens, to be welcome in our public spaces. So let me come back to the question. I'm going to come to you first, Autumn. What does equity mean in the context of parks and public space? And what additional barriers do we see when it comes to access?
Yeah, so the first year in this job, we really focused on doubling down what we mean when we say centering equity. And so for us, it's really this idea of starting with a shared history and really understanding how we got here. And so it's not enough for me to say that, oh, you should let everyone in and you should be nicer when people come, but to have our folks have a better understanding of how we got here, to understand policies of exclusion, to understand why certain populations don't feel as if they belong is an important starting point. Because if we become better students of history and better students of exclusion, then we are now able to see those points that are, like Richard said earlier, that are repeating themselves. So now we can start to see those systems, now we can start to see those processes, and then dismantle them as they're happening. So instead of having these requirements of you must do this, recognizing how that excludes some and changing that frame. So for us, it's really starting with these pieces of history. It's starting with skills and connections, recognizing for some reason for the past few decades, people believe in this idea of color blindness, and I'll treat you better if I pretend as if you're not different. For us, something that's very important is to really lift up difference and recognize that's okay, because if I see you and all that you are, right? You cannot separate my Blackness from my womanness, from my Missouri-ness, from my living in DC. And if you see all of that, then you're going to make sure that at places you recognize that, you lift it up, you respect it, and therefore I belong. And that's something that's really important that we've gotten away from. So for us, that's a big part of equity, is relearning some of these skills of just being a good person, right? Being able to have a conversation, being able to help folks feel that they belong by being inclusive, and really doing that individually, and then systematizing that. So if we know this works, what are the processes that we have to do to make sure that it stays in this agency, in this organization after we leave? And then if we move on to the barriers of access, a lot of it is that people don't see themselves. So seeing themselves physically in seeing other people that look like them, hearing different languages, having people be able to switch and help you be able to do that. And so those are just a few of the things that we're really starting to double down in. So not just defining equity, but helping relearn all of the pieces that have kept folks out, so that we can start to really poke and prod at these systems, so that everyone, not just the agency director, not just the person at the front desk, but everyone starts to see their piece and their power in really making change and helping people belong, feel that they belong.
Thank you so much. Vaughn, when you get into your description of the 11th Street Bridge, one of the cool new park projects in the United States, but first, I just want you to respond to that question, that what does equity mean in the context of parks and public spaces? And what additional barriers do you see when it comes to access?
Thanks, Mitchell. Autumn touched on a lot of different, I think, key areas. But as you talk about barriers, one of the things that really comes top of mind to me are those mental barriers. Right, like, and what I mean by mental barriers are, I think oftentimes they are these invisible boundaries that separate the parks from the community, and there's this disconnect. And then oftentimes when we're talking about these communities in urban areas, we're talking about Black and brown areas. And so how do we start to remove those invisible fences so that the people that live in those communities can feel a part of the park? And so now it's not the park and the community, but the community is a part of the park and the park is a part of the community. And then how do we look at redesigning the intentions of the park, right? So were those parks designed for the people that live in those communities? And if not, can we redesign how those parks are being used for the people that live in those communities now? I think about things like Autumn mentioned earlier, ownership, right? And how are we making sure that the people that live in those communities have some ownership in that park and they feel like it's theirs? And so whether that's revolving around some of the price points of things that are sold in the park, and making sure that the people that are in those communities can afford to purchase them, or whether that's having relevant programming, in the park for the residents that live in that community, not just people thinking this is what the community wants, but actually having a conversation with a lot of those community members to find out, what type of programming, jobs. are the people that are living in those parks actually people that live in those communities? And are we building up the skills of those community members so that they can be a part of that park family? And then the last thing I'll share, and it goes back to my mental barriers, and it's really around safety and security. Oftentimes in Black and Brown communities, there's this tension between policing and over policing. And the question that I would offer is like, how does that show up in the park, right? How are we making sure that residents both are feeling safe, but also are not feeling like they're over policed? I mean, Mitchell, you mentioned it earlier, right? 5 Black guys just sitting around in the park, and now all of a sudden it's loitering. But how are we making sure that people can still feel safe, but also that people aren't feeling like they're over policed? You know, in a lot of these communities, there is a large amount of trauma that have taken place, whether it's in their community or those parks have been used as spaces that have really been for no good, right? And so whether that's for drug use, whether that's for drug sales, and so how do we start to change both the mindsets of people understanding, oh, this should be a safe place for me, or how do we start to use those parks in order for healing to start to take place, both in the community as well as in the parks?
I want to do a very quick story because the all is something that we should all take to heart, because Olmsted designed parks as democratic spaces for all. I'll share this quick story. Morningside Park, another Olmsted design park in Morningside Heights. A garden club decided to restore one of the waterfalls. And then on the way out, beautiful restoration. The woman who headed up the garden club was handing me 33 cents. And I'm looking at the money and like saying, what is this? She says, oh, the 33 cents is from that homeless man over there. He wants to contribute to this park because this is where he comes every day to feel alive. That really checked me because saying, wait a minute, if you're unhoused, you're part of all. Yet we're struggling with this tension that if a person that does not have a home, does not have an access to nature and green space, where can this person go? So it really changed my disposition, understanding there are issues with the unhoused, but it really checked, do we really mean all when we say all, or do we just have it there because it sounds nice? So I'm just gonna leave that with the audience to think about it. Olmsted believe in all, we all believe in all, we have to make sure we all mean all. So Vaughn, one of the exciting projects in America, given that many lower income neighbors are also primarily communities of color, what can park leaders and municipal officials do when it comes to addressing inequitable access? But we also want you to tell us a little bit about the 11th Street Bridge and what you're doing to address this challenge.
Thanks. Again, I kind of talked a little bit about it earlier. I think the first thing you do is you talk to the people that live in that community. You talk to those stakeholders. You find out what are some of the things, how do they use the park? What are some of the things that they would want to use the park for? And not just go in with some assumptions. And then once you open that feedback loop, then you can start to say, all right, how can we work with the community? How can we collaborate with them? How can we identify and work with partners to help to bring some of these solutions to the park, right? And so it's not, you know, one of the things I often share is we believe the answers are always in the community, right? I don't need to come and bring the answers to you, but I can go and talk to the community and the answers are always in the community. And once they can tell me what the solutions are, then we can talk about what are some resources that we can bring to help those resources. So again, I'm at the 11th Street Bridge Park. We can show a couple of the pictures. We are transforming an old vehicular bridge into a recreational park. And from the very beginning, it's been a community-led project. You know, when this park was still just an idea, we literally had over 200 meetings with community leaders, with faith-based organizations, with small businesses to talk about, like, is this something that you even want in your community? And after there being some excitement around this idea of the Bridge Park, then we went and we said, all right, like, you know, what do you want it to look like? What kind of programming do you want to take place on the park? You know, what are some of the amenities, and so whether it's so all of the ideas that came from the park came directly from that community feedback. And so whether it's a canoe and kayaking launching place, or a hammock row, or a children's place, or a cafe, all of those ideas came directly from the community. But then we took it a step further, right? We heard from the community, yes, all of this is amazing, all of this is awesome, but what are we going to do for the community, right? Why do we need another park when we don't have a grocery store in our community? What about that? And so what are some resources, and what about every time we see development coming, right, people are getting displaced? And so how are we addressing that? And so what we did was go back to the community to really say, you know what, as we are looking across both the city and our country, we do realize that oftentimes, you know, there can be some negative unintended consequences, and sometimes intended consequences, you know, when development is coming into the communities. And so we work closely with a number of those stakeholders in our community to come up with a plan to make sure that the resources were staying in the community and that we could have development without displacement. And so what we did, we created with the support of a number of stakeholders within the community, what we call our equitable development plan. And it's focused on 4 major areas: housing, workforce, small business, and cultural equity. And we have 30+ strategies that are laid out in that plan. And ultimately, it's really about that equitable development plan made this much more than a park, but it made it something that you know, the community could get behind and the community could own.
Thank you, Vaughn. When is it supposed to be completed now? Because we're all excited about this project.
So right now, we're getting close. We in first quarter, second quarter of 2022, hopefully we're looking at breaking ground, and we're looking at an expected completion as soon as 2024.
Thank you so much. All right, so we've been talking about some issues and some challenges. Now I'm going to ask all the panelists, what are examples of communities and park officials that are doing creative things to ensure equitable access to parks? Okay, Autumn, I'm going to you first since there was a pause there. So Autumn, why don't you take it first?
Yeah, I can jump in. I've been lifting up this example because for me, it's a bit of two. So in general, what we're really trying to promote is both a culture of diversity, equity, and inclusion within agencies, right? So people understand why we're making changes, they understand how we got here, and so that people opt in, right? Creating this space where people want to do differently and do better. Another piece is really promoting data-driven solutions. And so if you have those two, you have folks working together for change. And so when I went home this summer, I got a chance to do tours with different agencies within Kansas and Missouri. And the example that Kansas City Parks did, Kansas City, Missouri Parks, and it was in Urban Land Institute, their report that came out a few months, is what they did. They had been doing a lot of work around social determinants of health. And so there are 6 zip codes that have the lowest life expectancy. One of them is the zip code that I grew up in. And so taking that data and trying to figure out, okay, we know this. We also know the issues with these parks, whether they be physical or, known or invisible barriers to park access for our Black and brown communities within these zip codes. What can we do? So they decided to do something, a 2-pronged solution, which I really believe is innovative. They created a new park district. Before, there were 3 park districts. They created a new park district that just for those 6 zip codes. They pulled some of their best staff, their best supervisors, their best park maintenance, and put them there. And then created really quick dashboards, like how many benches fixed, how many grills. I mean, it's Kansas City, you got to have grills in your parks. How many grills were replaced, right? How often is the lawn being mowed? Really quick metrics that we all, like those first steps of having a park be inclusive and feel safe. And what they also realized is that one of the reasons that these parks in our Black and brown communities may not be as inviting is the difference in the understanding and the willingness to engage with this system, right? If we think about structural racism, if we think about all that we're talking about, it's a result of systems. And so they've partnered with UMKC to have their Center for Neighborhoods do specific community-based learning opportunities on what the systems are to engage and improve upon your parks. So on the west side of the city, people knew who to call when a light went out. People knew how to get extra money for, a part of the park or to get something fixed, right? Because we know that some people with privilege, extra leisure time, education, they know the systems. They know who to call to get things fixed. So not only did they create this park district to focus on the physical amenities and to create connections with the community, but they also built that muscle. They also helped them learn the systems to understand how to make sure that if you want to have a special program for baseball at Satchel Paige, at Satchel Paige Stadium, this is how you lobby the city to get that money. If you have a problem with lights being out, this is who you call and this is how you call. If you're having problems with police or sightlines, this is what you do. And so I lift that up as an example of just a wonderful example of someone doing something differently, creating a district, but also recognizing that folks that have been excluded have reasons why they don't engage in systems. And so to have those learning opportunities, to have those conversations with communities to really build that capacity so that this is now their park, not just creating the district and saying that's enough, but how do we create these opportunities for people to engage and really have ownership and connection with these places?
I'll ask one more panelist to weigh in. We have about 8 minutes before we go to Q&A. And for those that are observing, please submit your questions to the Q&A box, not the chat box, because in about 8 minutes, questions to ask the panelists. So again, in the Q&A box, not the chat box. So if you want to cut and paste, you can do that. So our staff behind the scenes can get me the questions to ask the panelists. Does anybody else want to weigh in? Now, I would tout, of course, New York City, but I'll say go to a website, doing some great work on touching on access, equity, diversity, all of them. But do any other panelists want to weigh in on some of the great work some park officials or communities are doing in the country when it comes to equitable access to parks?
One of the things that's occurring, the Children Nature Network has a partnership with the National League of Cities, which represents something like 18,000 mayors and other urban officials, to define what it means to be a nature-rich city. And then to figure out, and the first way, the main thing they're doing there is they're talking to communities. They're not coming up with experts only. They're actually going into communities and asking them, what would it mean if there was more nature around you? What would it mean if there was more access to parks? What would it mean culturally to have that access? That's one of the things, and I'm a real fan of Vaughn and what you're doing, 11th Street Bridge. There are other projects around the country that are happening that are quite exciting. Some of them are not only bridges that are have more nature in them than in the past, but more, literally more nature. They're wildlife corridors, wildlife bridges. In LA, they're talking about bridges that are outside of LA that will allow mountain lions to move from area to area in Southern California. Right now, the mountain lions are starting to have mutations that they're beginning to change. They have crooked tails and things like that. But to the degree that we incorporate wildlife and native species into our parks, but also into the whole city, I think that that is one of the areas that there's pioneering work in. The other thing is to view parks not just as parks, but as the epicenters of change that percolates throughout an urban area or a rural area. And by that, I mean, biophilic design, biophilic architecture has caught on in recent years. A lot of people don't know what that is. But parks can be a force in changing our workplace, in convincing developers to weave more nature into the workplace, into schools. When they do that, they see productivity go up. Mitchell, you asked about some of the research. Some of the most interesting research is how having more nature around us affects our productivity, our creativity, our cognitive skills. Also, there is the issue of schools. During the pandemic, we saw a lot of schools give lip service, I think, to the idea of outside classrooms, outdoor classrooms for social distancing. That was the main motivation. There's a huge body of evidence now, or huge, relatively large body of evidence that suggests that this cognitive functioning in kids when they can get to a natural play space, sometimes that's a park. Sometimes it's the grounds of the school that have been changed into more natural areas. It's not only grades going up, it's the fact that kids who play in natural spaces are far more likely to invite other kids who don't look like them, not of their same gender or culture, to play with them. Bullying goes down. So, you know, what role, I would ask, can parks play to get beyond the park barrier, the park area, the specific thing called the park? I remember I was at Cornell University a few years ago, and the students and the teacher took me for a tour of some of the land owned by Cornell's. It was beautiful, it was a park. And the students were very excited about becoming botanical garden folks. And I asked them, do you ever talk about the city as a botanical garden? How can we begin to think about whole cities as places filled with nature and connection with each other, rather than only thinking them as places that have borders?
Well, we have 3 minutes for the next question. Richard, I was going to lean into you for this one because I just wanted to find out if you can do this concisely. Can you tell us or give us some examples of public health and parks community-based organizations that are collaborating to advance health equity?
The partnership with the Children Nature Network and the National League of Cities, I think that they are producing these connections all over the country, particularly in some of the pilot cities. I'm not that familiar with specific programs, so maybe some of your other—
I'll put Autumn on the spot. This way it'll give a chance for the questions to start coming in. So Autumn, I'm gonna put you on the spot. Just community-based organizations really advancing health equity.
Well, I know if I think about some of the really innovative work that's happening around health equity, a lot of it is community-based organizations that we don't necessarily think about. So if we think about recreation, as I talked about, a third of our recreation folks are partnering for farmers markets. We have seen recreation departments partnering with non-traditional health community-based organizations. So like Vaughn said, thinking about partnering with housing and human development, partnering with childcare in schools. And so we see a lot of partnering and thinking about what does the community need, not us coming in saying, hey, we're going to have this farmers market and this is what's going to happen. But if that is a request that's happening and folks are seeing it, really thinking about who does the community trust and how do we build relationships with them to be able to partner and help provide this. And so some of it's with childcare centers. We're seeing a lot more partnership with housing communities, low-income housing communities and recreation departments, and really going outside of the box of, what traditional healthcare is, but really moving towards who does the community trust? How do we develop a mutually beneficial partnership with that community organization and then follow their lead. So that's something that we're really switching, instead of coming in saying, this is what you need, here it is, but really going to who folks trust. So is it a mom and pop shop that has always given out turkeys, and clothes during the winter time? If that's who's the community trust, how do we develop a relationship with them and then follow their lead? So that's what I would say is something that is very much different in parks and recreation, and somewhere that we're going to identify non-traditional community-based organizations.
We got our first audience question, and I actually like this question quite a lot. What do each of you think is key to making parks part of our healthcare system? Now, let me just weigh in quickly to give you a chance to think, because this was something that really came to the forefront. This is not new. I think if we look at the work of Olmsted, he was way ahead of us. But during COVID is when this hit me really hard. We looked at parks as part of the healthcare system. That's where people were going. We looked at the tree as the original healthcare worker that provides comfort and shade, all these other benefits. And so we actually came up with this campaign. We put a green sign on a tree that said, it's okay to hug me, because you couldn't hug anybody else, during COVID. And so we wanted to make that connection that these were healthy spaces, and that Nature RX, this is not nothing uncommon, but double down to say, folks, this is not just green, happy spaces. These spaces kept us sane and alive during the pandemic and should be part of our healthcare system. So any of you want to weigh in on that before we go to the next audience question? How do we make parks more clearly part of our public healthcare system?
I think it has to be partnerships with public health and with pediatricians in particular. Park RX, Robert Czar, Dr. Robert Czar. I spoke at a 2010 American Academy of Pediatrics national conference, and Czar was in the audience, and he went back and he changed his practice. He began to literally write prescriptions for nature, but he didn't stop there. He reached out to his fellow pediatricians in Washington, D.C., and they started writing prescriptions, but they didn't stop there either. They created a database of all of the parks and all the open space in Washington, D.C. So the doc could not only look at the family and write a prescription to go spend some time in nature for your health, the doc could turn to the computer and say, there's a park a block and a half from your house, and here's what you can do there. There's another pilot program, and I don't know if it's finished or not, but it was in Portland, Oregon, where the park rangers became, essentially, they partnered with local doctors who sent people to these parks, and the park rangers became park health paraprofessionals, a role that they really liked. They were already doing it, but to formalize and honor that role, I think, is one of the examples of things that can be done.
Anyone else want to weigh in before I go to the next question?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think that we were talking earlier around like, how do we envision what parks are? And as I think about that, I think about like even with health, not just physical health, but spiritual health, emotional health, mental health. And how can we integrate practices that help to strengthen those different areas, integrate that in the park, right? And so while we might see like yoga in the park, can we also have like healing trance or restorative circles in the park? Could we have memorials like, to trees and name in memory of someone? And so just looking at different ways to, as we think about health, for somebody to be able to be healed, holistically, right? And so not just physical. Yeah, the walking is great, or the running and the biking, but other ways like prayer and meditation, other things where, people can really, it can help them be more complete.
Yeah, and I'll just tag on if I can. APHA has been doing a really great job of, if we think about the social determinants of health, we know that health is not created, is not always treated in the healthcare system. And so it's this very small model of what health is, right? Going to the doctor. What needs to continue to continue happening is a redefinition of what healthcare is, and healthcare happens in relationships. Healthcare happens in communities. Healthcare happens in families. And if we think about that, parks are a part of it. And so it's really this continuing, again, thinking about the system of healthcare and knowing what the issues are, really pulling back from recognizing I have to go here to get fixed, and recognizing really what is really maybe causing the problem. Maybe you're not going to the park. Maybe you're not connecting with people. Maybe you don't have these relationships. And that is just as important as making sure you take your medicine or going to see the doctor. So I would end with a push of, it's not parks being a part of healthcare, but us recognizing healthcare is just not the medical system. That is all these different systems that we engage with throughout the day, throughout our lives.
Very good point. For the sake of time, I'm going to go with you for this next question, Autumn. So hopefully you'll have a good response. This is the question. I'm very concerned about the graying of America, the silver tsunami, the aging population. And as we talk about access, are park professionals making contact with AARP to talk about some of their needs as we're seeing more and more of our Americans getting older?
Yeah, and I'll try and be short with this. Actually, we have just gotten a new grant. We've been a partner with the CDC and their arthritis and aging program. And we have over 200 recreation departments partnering with different facets of healthy aging. And so one of the great things is that, you know, good or bad, depending upon what side you sit on, our recreation departments have everybody, everyone from babies to folks coming for lunches to our seniors. And so this is something that's happening consistently. And so it's an evidence-based program with arthritis. As we know, we're going to have, actually, for the first time in American history, more folks that are over 55 and 65 than young people in the next 5 to 10 years. And so knowing that demographic, a lot of our folks have really been doubling down and using these evidence-based programs when it comes to seniors, and making sure that our folks can live life, can walk, can carry groceries, can age at home, can go up and down stairs. So we partner consistently with both CDC and other senior or seasoned membership organizations to make sure that we're there, because we're at the intersection of all the different ages, all the different people, all the different things.
We are getting so close to time. We probably have a minute for this response. If somebody weighs in, I just want to get to one more question. How do we enlist and help local officials and representatives to make these necessary changes? How can we convince city planners the value and benefits of a park?
Jump in really quick. I think it starts with, like Autumn mentioned it earlier, about relationships, and making sure you're building relationships first with the residents that live in those communities, so that they can understand the relevance and the importance of the parks in their communities. And these are the folks that can go and, you know, speak to City Hall and speak at city hearings and speak to their elected officials about, you know, why their parks are so important to them.
Yeah, I'll leave you all with this point, and this is one I've used over the years. I don't just talk about the cost, but I talk about the value. I know the cost of a park, but what's the value of providing a park where children with autism can play for the first time and feel joy? What is the value of a public space when a grandmother and a grandchild can come together post-COVID to hug? What is the value? And I think that we have to double down, not on just the cost, but the value. And what is the value of not investing in public spaces? We've seen it across the country, of the health disparities, of damaged relationships, of violence. So stop looking at the cost, look at the value. And that's what we have to lean in to our representatives. So with that, I'm going to ask all of you to quickly just give me your closing thoughts. We're going to start with ladies first. So Autumn, just give your closing thoughts before I turn it over to close out this amazing and powerful session. Thank you. Autumn.
Yeah, I'll end with the last point I've made is that, you know, it's up to all of us, whether we're Parks and Rec, whether we're health, whether we're planners, that we really start to recognize that health and wellness happens outside of the medical system, and that we all really play a role in it. It starts with relationships, and it starts with recognizing that if we all feel like we belong, great things can happen. So
thank you. Vaughn.
Yeah, thanks again for being invited. Had a great time. Certainly hats off to my other panelists. I think it just, you'll keep hearing me say it, making sure you have that continuous feedback loop with the community, and that they are a part of the process from the very beginning throughout the end, and that, whatever your process is, whatever your final product is, it can continue to be organic. And so you change as the community needs to change. If anybody wants to learn more about the Bridge Park, that you can visit www.bridgepark.org.
Thank you. And Richard, again, thank you for your contributions to this field for so many years. We all really just extending our great appreciation. So we'll give you your final thoughts, Richard.
Thanks. One of the reasons that outdoor classrooms have not increased in number as much as they should have during the pandemic is the friction between parks departments, schools, different departments within the school system. That's the major reason. People already get it. They want to do that, but the friction between turf areas is one of the main reasons. We have to face that. I'd like to mention in closing an issue that we haven't talked about. During the pandemic, when people were secluded, they started looking out their windows, and they saw that they may never have really looked at those birds. They saw the possum going through their yard, if they're lucky enough to have a yard, and the coyote that stopped and made eye contact. And they did not feel so alone when that happened. There's a loneliness epidemic that you all know about, not only in the United States, but in the world. Human isolation is up there with obesity and smoking in terms of the diseases that are associated with loneliness, human loneliness. We've had a lesson in loneliness during the last 18 months. I think that this loneliness epidemic has been blamed on Steve Zuckerberg and anti-social media and all kinds of things. But I think one of the things is there's a deeper loneliness, which is species loneliness. As a species, we are desperate not to feel alone in the universe. Why else would people look for Bigfoot? Why else would people look for intelligent life on other planets when it may not be a good idea to find it? It's because we don't want to be alone in the universe. To the degree we feel more and more alone, those diseases increase. Parks are a hugely important aspect in that. Parks aren't just places to breathe easier or to have more room. They're places of community. They link, they hold community together. And that's one of the most powerful things about parks is that they reduce loneliness. And now we know the cost of that loneliness.
Thank you, Richard. So I guess we're going to go from Facebook to face-to-face. So that's coming from Richard Louv. So Dee, I'm going to turn it over to you for closing remarks. Again, thank you, Autumn. Thank you, Vaughn. Thank you, Richard, for a very dynamic panel. I learned a lot, and I'm sure those who are listening learned as much as well. Dee?
Thanks so much, Mitchell. I must say, Facebook to face. I like that very much. And that's just the kind of thinking that Olmsted 200 is really trying to motivate. So I want to thank everyone for being here today. You all have been fantastic and have really, I think, inspired us to think about these topics that Olmsted was thinking about back in the 19th century. And I want to remind everyone that Olmsted 200 activities are in full swing, and they will run through Olmsted's bicentennial in 2022. We are posting new and diverse programs nearly every day on our website, so please go to our calendar where you can find opportunities for park advocacy, public education, tours, and conferences. And we aim to ensure that Olmsted's legacy endures by renewing public and policy commitment to our natural and historical heritage. So please go to olmsted200.org, sign up for our monthly newsletter, explore the calendar of events, submit your own events, and find toolkits for advocacy or education efforts. I want to draw attention in particular to one thing that's in our resource section. It's an equity task force that was undertaken in the Seattle Olmsted Parks. Well worth looking at, and we welcome these kinds of studies and efforts so that we can share what's going on out there. So please also follow Olmsted 200 on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Thank you all for joining us. Be on the lookout for more conversations with Olmsted. We'll see you again in November.